one of the long-living ships of that era, as it was used for more than 1.5 centuries. Translated, it means hunter. It was named after one of the specializations of Roman gladiators. Ancient Rome does not exist in Star Wars, but the name does. Venatores, like bestiary, were also a type of gladiator who fought animals in the arena and sometimes performed various tricks for the demanding Roman public, craving bread and circuses. That is, it was something between a hunter and a performer of ancient Roman theatre. Venator means hunter, a hunter of separatists, a republican showman, a tamer of wild separatist beasts, a name with meaning. The Venator was a universal tool of the Grand Army of the Republic. Reliable and substantial, like a hammer, with which you could nail the lid of something's coffin or drive your arguments into the head of your opponent. And there was plenty to drive. The Venator was armed to the teeth. Firing its main caliber inflicted a lot of negative emotions on the enemy, and its numerous air group knew how to prove to the opponent that if you are not for the Republic, then we will now turn you into Democrats, making you forget about independence if you even survive. So here it is, the cruiser. The hero of our story today is a heavy aircraft carrier cruiser having a solid air group in its hangars, but at the same time possessing impressive artillery armament. Ordinary aircraft carriers, including those in Star Wars, are essentially floating, well, in our case, flying airfields. The closest real-world analog to the Venator is the heavy aircraft carrier cruiser Admiral of the Fleet of the Soviet Union, Kuznetsov, a rather unusual ship which has been the subject of many debates among armchair experts on the internet. As always, we will start from afar for a complete picture and better understanding of how the Republicans got to this point and why they eventually needed a ship like the Venator. So, as you know, when the Kaminoans were commissioned to grow the clone army, weapons, equipment, ground vehicles, and space combat technology were created for them. To save time and money on the development of multiple samples of technology, new iron gadgets were often made based on already existing military and police machines. For instance, the predecessor of the AT-RT was a police walker. The predecessor of the LAAT was an analog of a police helicopter. And the ARC-170 was created based on the atmospheric bomber PTB-625. The past of the ATTE Walker was almost civilian. And the juggernaut A-5 rolled into the clone army without changes at all. But the situation with the Venator was different. The backbone of the Republic fleet had no direct predecessor. Moreover, the Venator became the progenitor of an entire generation of large combat ships, receiving the conditional name Star Destroyer. Though ships with a wedge-shaped design existed before, they were almost not built since the Rusan Reformation. It is incorrect to consider the Venator's predecessor to be the still unnamed Mandalorian warship with similar hull lines, which once fleetingly appeared in issue 17 of the comic series KOTOR. As later admitted by Dark Horse Comics Publishing, it was a mistake by the artist which, due to the large volume of products released in those years, was accidentally overlooked by the colleagues responsible for canon. Well, it happens. Human factor. But since what is written with a pen cannot be cut down with an axe, unlike the one who wrote it, this ship, externally resembling the Venator but only resembling it, is still part of the official Star Wars mythology. But it is not the predecessor of the Venator. Incidentally, it was in the same way, due to a timely, unnoticed mistake by the artists, that the Allegiance-type Star Destroyer appeared in Star Wars. Also, it is not worth considering the Harrower-class dreadnought, Harrower-class, as a predecessor of the Venator, the main large warship of the Sith Empire's fleet. Their tasks on the battlefield were similar. Some design features are also similar, and some external resemblance also takes place. However, it was not the forefather of the Venator, but still one should not think that the Venator was designed entirely from scratch. The creators of the Venator were the design bureau known throughout the galaxy of the shipbuilding giant corporation Kuat Drive Yachts. The inhabitants of the planet Kuat had not just many years but millennia of experience in the development and mass production of large warships, including ships created relatively recently, the experience of developing which formed the basis of the Venator. Interestingly and painfully characteristic, people of Kuat were not very much affected even by one of the treaties accompanying the Rusan Reformation, which at one time significantly limited the size, firepower, and hyperspace speed of warships, a kind of analogous to the Versailles Treaty from the real world. Thus, the Kuat Drive Yards, even though located in the center of the galaxy near the capital, openly ignored the treaty, which the Galactic Senate forced all other governments to comply with under the threat of financial sanctions or worse. As the well-known Roman saying goes, what is allowed to Jupiter is not allowed to an ox. If you have money, power, and influence, you can always lobby for the appropriate permission in the Senate. After all, as another old saying goes, a Jewish proverb, if problems can be solved with money, then it's not a problem, but merely expenses. To some extent, the predecessor of the Venator can be considered to be the Kuati super battleship Mandator, from which our hero borrowed many elements of internal layout and a number of design solutions, but in a reduced form naturally, for the length of the Mandator dreadnought reached 8 kilometers. And on the picture on your screen now is Mandator 4. Also, by the way, not a small thing, of course, it could have been possible to adopt the already mastered in production Mandator or the modernized Praetor, also a creation of the Kuati. But these were excessively large and thus very expensive ships, which also took too long to build. Initially, the designers aimed to develop something smaller and less powerful than the Mandator or Praetor, but more suitable for mass production, and they succeeded. Even during the war, from the moment a ship was laid down to its launch in fully combat-ready condition, no more than 4 months passed. Well, 2, 3 months if they really pushed, and the shipyard was good. On simpler shipyards, compared to the Kuat yards or Rothana, the ship was assembled in 6, 7 months. And considering how many slips are available on those enormous orbital shipyards of Kuat, and on the surface of the capital planet and other planets of the system, to avoid tiring you with numbers, suffice to say that the Kuat Drive Yards Corporation could commission up to 1,200 ships a year without straining too much. That, by the way, answers the old bewildered question of part of the fan base about where the Galactic Empire got as many as 25,000 Imperial-class Star Destroyers. That's where. Ships in the Star Wars universe are built very quickly, and because of this they aren't particularly spared, often being abandoned or simply sent for scrap when the vessel could still be repaired. Remember the junkyard in Jedi Fallen Order? Now imagine if the Grand Army of the Republic had tried to serially produce the Mandator or a similar behemoth. The assembly of such a ship would take up to 2 years, even with simultaneous module construction on a dozen slips. And why did the Grand Army even need a new type of ship? At that time, the prevailing concept in the galaxy was large warships with predominantly energy artillery armament, such as laser, turbo laser, or ion cannons. Missiles and torpedoes, if installed at all, were considered secondary armament, and hangars for small flying vehicles, SFVs, meaning fighters and bombers, were quite rare. Moreover, hangars capable of accommodating more than 1 squadron of heavy or 2 squadrons of light fighters were even rarer. A prime example, or even an icon of this concept, can be the most common large warship of those years, the Dreadnought-class heavy cruiser. Built by the Rendili or Starchitect companies, this type appeared more than 100 years before the Clone Wars and started being actively used 80 years before the war. The first modifications of this ship had no hangars at all, only external docking nodes. Later, indeed, modifications of the dreadnoughts were built with a small internal hangar, but only as a forced measure. The ship's design did not allow for a large hangar. And just before the Naboo crisis, the Trade Federation and similar megacorporations started rapidly increasing their armed forces. Of course, the Trade Federation had its own armies and fleet long before that. Good merchants, aren't they? But these were forces of the classic type, so to speak. They were gradually replaced by battle droids, droid starfighters, and similar entities. This process became particularly active following the cunning plot involving the Sith, primarily, of course, Darth Sidious, when the Trade Federation's leadership became dominated by the Neimoidians. It was then that their famous droid army emerged, and thus the crisis on Naboo occurred. In the scale of the galaxy, this was, of course, a minor event. After all, every day, somewhere in the far, far stretches, someone was occupying, capturing, bombing, imposing sanctions. In general, just ordinary civilized life. But people who could think with their heads immediately realized that the concept of waging war had changed. After all, the Trade Federation had bet on numerous unmanned fighters and bombers. an entire swarm of relatively cheap metal, which was difficult to handle with the available ships that focused on large guns. Even Dreadnought had problems with anti-aircraft guns. And the military concluded, "We have to do something about this." And they did decide. Since they have a swarm of fighters, we need to respond with our own swarm of fighters. However, the carrier ship had to possess formidable firepower, as it did before, a sort of compromise. This is how the Venators and Acclamators in carrier modifications appeared. While some were developing the art, their enemies usually thought about the latter. They also thought about the upcoming galactic-scale dispute on Quat. And they thought in such a way that the sight of some of their ships openly violating Republic-wide restrictions made all of Quat's enemies cross themselves fervently, and they tried to avoid the sector by the 10th way. The mother of the Venator was the talented shipbuilding engineer Lyra Wessex, maiden name Blissix. She was the daughter of an equally talented shipbuilder, Walex Blissix. Father and daughter constantly competed with each other. For example, the design bureau under Walex's leadership created the Delta VII Interceptor, the Victory-class Star Destroyer, and later, for the New Republic, he also created the Republic-class Star Destroyer. Then he contributed to the creation of the best, in my opinion, Star Destroyer of those years, the Nebula-class Star Destroyer, also for the New Republic. Lyra gifted the galaxy the Venator, the Imperial, and then even managed to work on the Executor. Now let's move on to the construction of the Venator. Although the most notable feature of the Venator is its hangar, as it is a carrier, I will begin my review of the ship with its armament. There is much to say here because the Venator had not only significant but also hefty gun arguments. Now on your screen is a dual turbo laser tower with heavy DBY 827 turbo lasers. This is the main caliber of the Venator-class Star Destroyer. The tower and turbo lasers were designed by the company Time and Back with the participation of engineers from Quat Drive Yards. And the production of the guns was entirely taken over by the factories of Time and Back. Even before the Clone Wars, this company was considered one of the galactic leaders in the market of blaster, laser and turbo laser cannons. Although they attempted to engage in the production of starships and speeders, they did not succeed. Subsequently, the Time and Back cannons were installed on almost all major ships of the Galactic Empire, and later on those of the New Republic. The DBY 827 is an extremely powerful weapon, even surpassing the main caliber turbo lasers of Imperial-class Star Destroyers, although the total energy volley of an ISD was still greater due to the larger number of turbo lasers, specifically by 30%. 64 main caliber barrels on an ISD versus 16 on a Venator. During the Clone Wars and after, Venators often operated as line ships similar to battleships. But this was out of necessity, as the Venator's overall firepower was inferior even to their contemporaries, such as the Victory-class Star Destroyers, though those were much smaller. Well, and you can't really expect something new from a ship that is an aircraft-carrying cruiser. The Venator's cannons had a fairly large firing sector, about 150 degrees horizontally and about 90 degrees vertically. Their placement at different height levels allowed all barrels to fire forward and in the upper hemisphere. However, engaging in broadside exchanges was not advisable, as in such a case only half the cannons could be used. Republican captains often solved this problem simply. They would turn the ship sideways and fire upwards. A keen observer surely recalls the broadside volley exchange reminiscent of 17, the 19th century sailing ships seen in the beginning of Episode 3. In the film, this was a kind of homage to real naval battles of the Age of Sail. It looks beautiful and impressive after all. But in the Star Wars lore, this moment has an explanation. Such a broadside shootout happened almost by accident. Originally, the Golara, that was the name of that Venator, was supposed to attack General Grievous's invisible hand from a different angle. However, the Admiral plans and life happens. And what happened, happened. Nevertheless, I will not dwell on this right now. The DBY 827 turbo lasers had 7 power modes for firing. At the lowest power, the turbo lasers could fire at a high rate and be used for suppressive fire against fighters and bombers, thereby complementing the light laser cannons. At the highest power, seriously taxing the ship's energy systems and causing rapid overheating, the DBY 827 battery could easily punch a through hole several meters in diameter in the hull of a corvette or even a frigate. In space combat, depending on the situation, 3 firing options were used. The first option was alternating fire, where the first shot would breach shields or armor, and the next would fly through the breach formed. The shots were fired at medium power levels 4, 5. This was very useful if a critical component of the enemy ship needed to be taken out, such as engines or the command bridge. But such a shot required excellent artillery skills, reliable work from sensors and targeting systems, and the necessity for prolonged aiming, which is not always possible given the enemy electronic warfare capabilities, meaning sacrificing rate of fire was unavoidable. Naturally, such a sniper double shot was almost impossible when firing at small ships with high speed and maneuverability. The second option was alternating fire from 2 barrels at a high tempo. This method of employing the DBY-827 was less intriguing but looked more impressive. The firing was conducted at a low power level of 1, 3. However, even at low power, the turbo lasers could not maintain a high rate of fire for long. After half a minute or a minute, the firing had to be stopped to allow the cooling systems to manage the overheating. This mode was intended for hitting lightly protected, highly maneuverable, and fast targets. Additionally, this mode could be used for providing fire support from orbit for ground units. The third option was simultaneous firing from 2 barrels at maximum power level 6, 7. This was the primary firing mode in squadron battles with other large ships and during orbital bombardment. In this case, the rate of fire of the cannons was low and significantly strained the ship's reactor, but the effect was highly destructive. Although in Star Wars most ships do not seem to suffer from gigantomania as in some other fictional universes, still pay attention to the size of these cannons and this turret. Judging by the figures of the clone troopers in the picture, the diameter of the barrel channel of this cannon is about 6 meters. A 2-story suburban house could fit in it. And then there's the cable running from the reactor. Its diameter is approximately 8 meters. And a few more words about the power of the DBY-827 turbo lasers. You surely know about the base Delta Zero order. This code was used in the meaning of exterminatus, in which ship artillery scorched the entire surface of a planet. And we all know that the Venators and larger star destroyers were masters of exterminatus. But for some reason few know that this order appeared during the Clone Wars. Venators sometimes conducted this very exterminatus. If there were too many separatists on a planet, and assaulting it would take a long time and result in heavy losses, they would burn it to ashes and forget it. War justifies everything, the whole world in ruins, but then, let's continue with Venator weaponry. Understanding that having hundreds of fighters in the hangar was, of course, good, but anti-aircraft artillery was also necessary. The Venator was equipped with 52 light, rapid-firing laser cannons, and that is a lot in the realities of Star Wars for a ship of such a size. In terms of anti-aircraft armament, the Venator had no equal among military ships that ever bore the designation Star Destroyer. Most of the light cannons were placed along the edges of the ship, providing them with a good firing sector. An additional number were located along the central hangar. They shielded fighters and bombers during launch and enhanced the hangar's defenses during battle. Additionally, these guns could intercept missiles or torpedoes. However, as the war experience showed, even such a quantity of light laser artillery did not always save the convoys from the bombers and gunships of the Separatists. For anti-ship combat, the Venator was equipped with 4 torpedo launchers. The total ammunition capacity was 64 proton torpedoes, with 16 torpedoes per launcher. If desired, they could be adapted for launching missiles, which also helped repel attacks from droid fighter-bomber swarms. The Venator's arsenal didn't end there. There were also 2 double-barreled medium turbo lasers placed on the facets in the front part of the hull. These were rather useless weapons, to be honest. They were installed simply because there was free space available. The future Vader managed to fit the ultra-heavy SPAA self-propelled artillery in the turbo laser YO variant into the Venator's lower hangar, thus increasing the ship's firepower in close combat in the lower hemisphere. Ingenious lad went far indeed. And the last, so to say, weapon, 6 tractor beam projectors. Their generators and part of the projectors were located in the bow section. Tractor beams were used to capture small vessels, including the limitation of maneuvering, in other words, immobilizing the same fighters and bombers, so anti-aircraft gunners could take them down, like in a shooting range. If necessary, the tractor beam projectors could ensure a soft landing for a heavily damaged fighter, bomber, or even a LAAT. Now let's discuss the carrier group's composition of the Venator itself. At the time of commissioning, still secret then, it was planned to have up to 420 fighters and bombers on the upper hangar deck, the lower hangar and the side hangars, and up to several dozen shuttles, such as from 20 to 40 LAATs. The standard carrier group was supposed to be composed of 192 V-19 Torrent Starfighter, later replaced by the same number of Alpha 3 Nimbus light fighters, 192 Delta 7 interceptors, later replaced by ETA 2 Actis interceptors, and 36 RC-170 heavy fighters, which means 16 squadrons of light fighters, 16 squadrons of interceptors, and 3 squadrons of heavy fighters, plus up to 40 LAATs in infantry and transport variants, and several cargo passenger shuttles, such as the Kappa-class shuttle. Impressive, isn't it? However, in reality, Venators never flew with 4,500 fighters on board. It was impractical and simply dangerous. Dangerous for the Republic budget. I'll explain why later. Most of the ship's internal space, about 60% of its length, was allocated to one huge hangar, divided into equal sections, equipped with sturdy bulkheads, armored sliding doors, and force fields. Bulkheads were necessary for greater protection of aircraft from enemy fire. If one of the compartments was breached, the fighters in the second compartment remained unscathed, allowing the technical personnel to continue working without issues. Armored hatches also provided additional protection for each compartment. This was especially important when the carrier opened the main doors, exposing the entire hangar. Force fields were needed to maintain the atmosphere and retain air. Each compartment could accommodate several shuttles or fighters, sometimes up to a squadron, and could be sealed with an armored hatch if necessary. The bulkheads between compartments could be retracted into the hull, thereby increasing the internal space of the hangar and connecting multiple compartments. This partially removed the length restrictions on fighters within the hangar. Such restrictions, by the way, existed on Imperial Star Destroyers. The Venator also had 2 side hangars that served for receiving and dispatching shuttles and other light transport vessels. However, if needed, fighters and bombers could also nest there. The side hangars were connected to the main hangar by transporters and wide corridors. This made it easier to move aircraft between hangars inside the ship, as well as transport tools, equipment, and armaments. Another large hangar entrance-exit was located in the belly of the ship. Very convenient when it is necessary to take off from the main hangar without opening the massive gates into which the enemy could launch something explosive and very unpleasant. Additionally, this belly hangar was used to board ships they wanted to capture. Remember the boarding of Leia Organa's Corvette in Episode 4? It was done in just the same way. When the Venator landed on a planet, this hangar could be used for loading various items, such as food supplies, ammunition, and equipment. There were a couple of cranes with good lifting capacity for this purpose. The same cranes were also used for capturing and holding a ship. By the way, side hangars could also be used for loading and unloading supplies. Using retractable docking tubes, the ship could dock with space stations or when landing on a planet. Fighter launches were carried out in several ways. The primary method was launching the air group through the main hangar doors, which opened along its entire length. On one hand, this allowed the entire air group to be launched into space in a short period. But on the other hand, it made the hangar very vulnerable to enemy ship cannons, torpedoes, and missile bombers. If the launch took place during battle under enemy fire, it was sometimes more prudent to use the exit on the belly of the carrier. This method took more time, but the ship wasn't at risk of getting a barrage of torpedoes in the vulnerable hangar. It is worth noting that during the Clone Wars, many carriers were lost due to the ship commander's desire to launch the air group more quickly. The enemy, having managed to react in time, destroyed ships with coordinated fire directly into the hangar. There were also instances where an open hangar was cleverly used by separatists as a breach for boarding teams. This was even once executed against Obi-Wan Kenobi's flagship. Additionally, I would note that the use of side hangars and central sliding doors was later deemed impractical and even dangerous in the design of Imperial-class Star Destroyers, ISD. which is why ISDs used only the hangar in the lower part of the hull. However, it should also be noted that some commanders managed to successfully deploy the Venator's air group through sliding doors even under enemy fire. For example, during the Battle of Ryloth, Admiral Yularen simply turned his carrier belly up toward the enemy, thereby protecting the fighters and bombers with the ship's hull. A risky but justified move. I've paid particular attention to air group launch methods, as the speed of launching spacecraft, fighters and bombers directly affects the response time of both the carrier ship and the entire carrier group to changes in tactical situations. Now let's consider some numbers. How long did it take the Venator to launch its entire massive air group? In total, the main hangar had 42 cells, each about 20 meters wide. Each cell could accommodate 3 light fighters or 2 heavy ones. The side hangars could hold 12 light or between 6 to 8 heavy fighters. Let's assume that on our Venator, the air group consists only of Nimbuses, only light fighters, and there are no LAATs on the flight deck and in the side hangars. All the craft are armed, fueled, and ready for takeoff, with pilots already seated, eager for separatist blood. Thus, in the ideal battle-ready situation where the crew had time to fully prepare, we have 126 fighters in the main hangar, which equals 10.5 squadrons, and no more than 24 machines, 2 squadrons in the side hangars, totaling around 150 fighters out of a possible 450-strong air group. During this time, other machines are in the hangar beneath the flight deck and naturally not ready for takeoff. To bring them up and prepare them for launch would take time, by which the battle would likely be over, as space battles in Star Wars are almost always brief. Of course, it is possible to keep machines ready for takeoff on the main runway with the hangar closed, plus in the cells. By the size of the runway, another 2 squadrons, roughly 25 aircraft, can be prepared for takeoff. Now, let's talk about launch speed. Launching can occur in stages, with machines exiting the hangar sequentially, cell by cell, or taking off simultaneously from opposite ends of the runway. In the latter case, the launch pace would slow when the queue reaches the machines in the middle cells. Judging by the launch speed in the animated series The Clone Wars, it would take no less than 3, 5 minutes, or even all of 10 minutes to launch all 150 ships if the guys in the flight control center are a bit clumsy. 150 machines in 5 or 10 minutes, while the remaining fighters would still be idling on the ship for at least half an hour. And this is an ideal situation. In a typical battle scenario, where several minutes might pass between the appearance of enemies on radar screens and the start of shooting, the number of deployed aircraft would be significantly less, presumably 70, 100 machines. Now let's remember the Imperial Star Destroyer, ISD. The hangar configurations of ISDs are not identical across all ships in the series. There are minor differences. Sometimes there are several large sections, but more often, TIE fighters are also housed in compartment cells, somewhat reminiscent of those on a Venator class. The second variant is depicted in incredible cross-section on pages 6, 7. On the Venator, a cell is shielded by a force field that retains air, while on the ISD, each cell is covered with its own armored hatch. There are a total of 22 such cells on the Star Destroyer, 8 of which are used for TIE fighters and TIE interceptors, while the remaining ones house shuttles, fighters with landing gear, and TIE bombers. The latter, along with their bombs, are kept in a separate, well-armored section for safety reasons. On the ISD, as is known, TIEs hang from the ceiling on special rails, which expedite their launch. The fighters can literally be spat out into space, a process also facilitated by the tractor beam projector. As a result, an ISD can launch its entire air group significantly faster than a Venator, approximately in 3 minutes. Moreover, the entire air group can be launched on the first unload, as it is all located in the main hangar and not scattered around. Thus, in a standard combat situation, an ISD could field 5 squadrons of light fighters, 1 squadron of heavy fighters, and 1 squadron of bombers. In total, this amounts to 84 ships, compared to the 70 to 100 ships of the Venator's air group. In a duel situation, 60 TIE fighters would be quite capable of protecting their carrier from the attacking enemy air group, delaying them somewhere along the way. In the meantime, the ISD's deck artillery would be tearing the Venator itself apart. Additionally, due to this bias towards the air group, the Venator had less room for ground troops, which can be considered a disadvantage. It carried only 2,000 clone troopers and minimal armored vehicles. Meanwhile, within the ISD could be placed a full legion of stormtroopers, consisting of 9,700 soldiers and over 100 pieces of armored vehicles, including heavy AT-AT walkers, as well as 1 to 2 rapid deployment bases, and for dessert, up to a regiment of naval infantry. Although sometimes the Venator's lower hangar was converted to carry troops, allowing for more armored vehicles and even the construction of bunks for clone cannon fodder, this retrofit was not always performed. However, this was not alarming as the Venator was not an assault ship. The role of the LPD, the large landing ship in the Clone Wars, fell to the Acclamators. Speaking of the crew, the Venator's crew consisted of 7,400 individuals. Not very many considering the crew sizes on other warships of a similar size from that era. At the beginning of the war, the crew consisted solely of clones due to the secrecy of the clone army. By the end of the war, however, many Venators had non-cloned crews. The exact percentage is difficult to ascertain as sources do not specify. The dimensions of the Venator are as follows. Length 1,137 meters, width 548 meters, height 268 meters, including the height of the superstructure. These dimensions were typical for most ships of this type, but there were slightly larger models with a length of 1,155 meters. It might seem that 18 meters is trivial for a ship over a kilometer in length, but given its proportionally increased width and height in such a case, the enlarged Venators could accommodate several compartments with additional special equipment. A useful innovation by Lyra Wessex and her father was the design of the captain's bridge interior, which later became customary for Star Destroyers of most types. The main bridge staff was located in two, so to speak, pits to the sides of the central aisle and the captain's chair. The right tower of the Venator was the main bridge, housing the ship's commander, sensor operators, and the fire control station. The left tower contained the flight control center, which handled the tactical coordination of the air group and the communications officers. At the same time, part of the flight control, mainly during the takeoff and landing stages, was carried out from the command post located at the base of the hangar. However, if one of the superstructure towers was destroyed, tactical coordination could still be managed from there. There was also a reserve control post for the helmsman, although it was not a fully fledged equivalent of the captain's bridge. It is often said that the bridges of Star Destroyers are vulnerable due to their superstructures that protrude significantly above the hull. Yes, this is partly true, although it should be reminded that these bridges had decent armor and were well protected by deflector shields. The shield generators were located next to the side hangars, one on each side. There also lay some of the main shield projectors. Other shield projectors were located inside the superstructure. Consequently, it was harder to put the shield projector generators out of action compared to those of the R shields, whose domes stood out as targets on top of the superstructure. The shields, powerful weaponry, and indeed the whole ship were powered by 3 hypermatter reactors. The main reactor was located aft, directly beneath the superstructure, under strong armor protection. 2 auxiliary reactors were housed in what might best be termed sponsons. The output of the auxiliary reactors was sufficient to meet all the needs of the Venator. Most often they were turned off. Next to the auxiliary reactors were massive energy cells, essentially batteries. These enormous battery arrays stood several tens of meters tall. With their charge, a Venator could survive for some time and even engage in combat to some extent. This was useful, for example, if a heavily damaged ship needed to be withdrawn from battle with damaged or disabled reactors. Although disabling a Venator's reactors, and even more so causing their detonation, was quite problematic, even if the enemy fervently desired it and their ship had powerful cannons with good armor-piercing capabilities. After all, the Venator's reactors were entirely hidden within the hull. On one hand, this consumed valuable internal space, but on the other, it improved survivability. Furthermore, rendering a Venator powerless, even with massive ion cannon and ion missile barrage, was very difficult. In comparison, on an Imperial Star Destroyer, part of the main reactor's dome protruded beyond the hull's confines. Even though the dome was well armored and protected by deflectors, Instances of its detonation under massive bombardment had occurred. A squadron of rebel rotors, as pilots called their B-wings, engineered a significant reactor explosion for their Imperial counterparts, with all the ensuing consequences. Of course, the Imperial Star Destroyer, like any large military ship, also had an auxiliary reactor located in the forward section. However, it was just one and could not meet all the energy needs of a battleship as two auxiliary reactors on a Venator could. And still, I believe the designers of the Venator were overly cautious with the number and power of the reactors. Speaking of power, the peak total power output of all three Venator reactors is, here's the attention, 3.6 yottawatts, 10 to the 24th power. The power of a small weak star, for instance, the total power radiation of our sun is estimated by scientists to be 382.8 yottawatts. Consequently, the Venator generated only 106 times less energy than the sun. One could either marvel at the technologies from a galaxy far, far away, or consider that the author of the official Incredible Cross-Sections Manual for Episode 3 grossly exaggerated, to put it mildly. Perhaps not, since we know of reactors in Star Wars of similar or even greater power. And yet I strongly doubt that the Venator could consume even 1 yottawatt of energy. It probably did not need that much. The Venators, along with reactor fuel, were located between the main hangar and the superstructure, complete with the necessary insulation, cooling system, pipelines, and other associated equipment. All of this took up a lot of space, as you can see. The engine nacelles, of which our carrier cruiser had an entire 3-level array, also took up a lot of space. The Venator had 8 engines, 4 main LF9 model Ion engines manufactured by Alderaan Royal Engineers. Identical Alderaanian engines were installed on Victory-class Star Destroyers, though not on all of them. Yes, on Alderaan they were skilled in producing not only delicious wine and troublesome senators. On Alderaan they did a great many things, from trivialities to creating enemies of the imperial regime. Although for the most part Alderaan is known as a producer of agricultural product. But let's return to the engines. In addition to the 4 primary engines, the Venator-class Star Destroyer was equipped with 4 auxiliary Ion engines, classified as second and third tiers, or secondary and tertiary, as some might prefer. Most large warships use auxiliary engines during acceleration to reach maximum speed and for maneuvering. However, on the Venator, all engines were engaged during maneuvering. As each engine nozzle, fitted with electromagnetic plates and a complex system of force fields, could deviate in any direction. This means each Venator engine had a thrust vectoring capability, similar to that of modern 5th generation and 4++ generation fighters. Considering the size of the Venator's engines, I find it difficult to imagine the complexity of the mechanisms involved and how challenging it must have been to repair them without sending the ship to dry dock, where appropriately sized cranes, force fields, gravity generators, and repair droids were available. You might ask why the Venator had 8 engines in the first place. The answer is quite simple: survivability, to make it harder to immobilize the ship. I can't recall a single instance during the entire service period of the Venator where this beauty lost all its engines due to enemy fire, although there were cases when separatists managed to destroy all the primary and some of the auxiliary engines. Of course, immobilizing a Venator would have been even harder if the engines were placed in different sections of the stern and heavily armored. Dispersed engines are hard to blow up with a single, powerful and precise salvo. However, in that case, Lyra Wessex and her engineers would have had to brainstorm intensely, resort to trial and experimentation, and perhaps even pray to the machine god to devise a way to disperse the engines across the stern without significantly increasing the ship's width and height. As long as the engines were clustered together near the reactor, they could be installed relatively compactly. Space on the ship wasn't infinite. The engineers at Quat already had to extend the length of the engines beyond the ship's frame outside the armor. The ship's engines were exceptionally powerful. The entire bouquet of 8 engines could propel the carrier cruiser to 40 space units, 40 MGLT. This was 20 units less than that of the Imperial Star Destroyer, but still impressive for such a ship. However, the Venator's speed in the atmosphere was almost at the level of modern airliners, only 975 kilometers per hour. In any case, a kilometer-long ship has no place in the atmosphere. I will speak about atmospheric flights a bit later. The maximum acceleration of the Venator was 3,000 g, Naturally, with such acceleration, an inertial compensator was needed. Otherwise, during a rapid increase in speed, the immense G-forces would instantly turn the crew into an intriguing puzzle for a forensic pathologist. The inertial compensator, cooling and waste disposal systems, and the hyperdrive were located in the stern in a peculiar tail section between the ion engines. This improved their protection in typical head-on ship battles. The shipbuilders of Quat, for some reason, very much liked to place hyperdrives in the stern rather than inside the ship. By the way, the hyperdrive on the acclimator was also located there. You see, if the enemy managed to come from the stern, with the intention of thoroughly shooting and causing serious trouble to the crew, the hyperdrive could easily be put out of action since the armor thickness in that place was, to put it mildly, not very substantial. But in such a case, the Venator had an answer in the form of an auxiliary hyperdrive hidden within the hull. To destroy it, one would have to tear apart almost the entire ship. The hyperdrive's speed was superb, and the navigational supercomputer was the envy of many. First class by the standards of that time. It was nearly the ultimate speed for ships of such size. However, the auxiliary hyperdrive on the Venator was installed between the 12th and 15th class. The ship flew very slowly, unhurriedly, like a drowsy Estonian tortoise, although even that sufficed if one needed to reach a repair dock and one's ship. For obvious reasons, and I can't avoid a comparison with ISDs as they're often compared, the pride and joy of the Imperial Starfleet had a somewhat inferior second-class hyperdrive, while the reserve hyperdrive was already better at the 8th class. Partly because of this, it was so difficult for the Imperials to chase after fleeing rebels when they operated in their usual hit-and-run tactics. The maximum flight range of the Venator on a single reactor refueling was 60,000 light-years. Combined with the ship's 2-year autonomy, this allowed the Venator to go on very long and extended raids. Listening to all this, you surely have already wondered, where is space for the crew and the troops? Do not worry, this space dwelling had room for all residents. Part of the crew quarters and medical bays were located in the superstructure and underneath it, right above the reactor. Specifically, it was where most of the turbo laser and laser cannon crews and technical personnel lived, especially those guys who monitored the work of the engines and reactors, so they would be closer to their place of duty. The cabins of the rest of the crew were located on the edges of the hull. If the Venator took fire to the side, these cabins served as a kind of additional armor for the vital compartments. After all, the enemy's lasers and missiles would first need to penetrate the armor, and then also pass through multiple levels of cabins with all their bulkheads and blast doors. So, if you are an enemy of the Republic or the Empire, shoot at the Venator from the upper hemisphere, preferably in the hangar area. But be aware, the Venator has quite the arsenal to retaliate against your military mischief. As previously mentioned, the Venator could land on the surface of a planet. It could be any flat but very hard surface, as the ship weighed tens of thousands of tons. Alternatively, these could be specially prepared landing platforms. Examples of such platforms were seen in Episode 3. Although they tried to avoid bringing the Venator into the atmosphere, better safe than sorry. The danger to avoid was enemy air defense systems, planetary defense systems, and even high-powered artillery. While highly maneuverable in space, in the atmosphere, the Venator became a clumsy suitcase, an easy target that everyone wanted to fire at. A moment of history from a galaxy far, far away. Before the release of Episode 3, it was believed and written in official English sources that the largest Imperial ship capable of planetfall was the Victory-class Star Destroyer, which, let me remind you, is 900 meters long. This is why the Victory had such enormous repulsors on its sides. But then came the film where we saw the 1,137-meter-long Venator easily taking off and landing on a planet, after which the official sources wrote that both the Venator and the Victory were the largest combat ships capable of such an action. And what happened next? Disney happened to Star Wars. A poor-quality animated series, Rebels, and a pretty good film, Rogue One, were released, showing that an Imperial Star Destroyer can not only take off and land, but also hover in the atmosphere as if glued. Now, we accept this fact as a given. From the very first days of the Clone Wars, Venators became the main combat ships of the Republic fleet. Victory-class Star Destroyers appeared later, but they did not fully meet the needs of the time due to their modest hangar volume. Although in conjunction with the Venetors, the victories could cause a lot of trouble. Good deeds for the Republic and very unpleasant deeds for the Confederacy. The Victory had excellent missile armament and guns, while the Venator had a large air complement and also good guns. The victories began to be mass-produced in the second half of the Clone Wars. But the mass production of Venators was established even before the war. Their construction proceeded at a truly rapid pace. From the moment the first ship models were laid down to the commissioning of a ready starship took 3 and sometimes 2 months, and the assembly of modules and their installation were simultaneously carried out on thousands of slips. It goes without saying that the Old Republic had never seen such large-scale warship construction. Even during the Great Galactic War, both the First and Second, ships were not built this quickly as there was no need. However, the production technologies were not as advanced then. The scale of Venator production is evidenced by this fact alone. In the Battle of Coruscant, one of the most pivotal engagements of the war, the Republic was able to field 1,000 Venators on the battlefield. Try to imagine this armada, 1,000 carrier cruisers, and along with ships of other types and classes, it was a real bloodbath. The Separatist fleet over Coruscant also, by the way, numbered in the thousands of ships. But such large-scale cultural military kill-fest events were rare. During the Clone Wars, the fleet of the Grand Army preferred to operate in relatively small squadrons, task forces, numbering 3 to 4 Venators each. Interestingly, sometimes these squadrons did not even have escort ships in the form of light cruisers and corvettes. This was due to the presence of an enormous air group capable of adequately protecting the carrier ship from any threat. Here should have been a fragment comparing the characteristics of the Venator with the main large combat ships of the Separatists. Most of the Confederacy's ships were inferior to the Venators in firepower, but were still serious opponents, primarily if we consider the cost-effectiveness ratio. Of course, the gentlemen of the Confederacy had huge and fearsome ships like the Subjugator, particularly the Malevolence, the flagship of General Grievous. After the conclusion of the Clone Wars, the Venators did not have less work. Although by the end of the war, several thousand Victory-class Star Destroyers had already been built, and at the very end of the theater of war, the Quat Drive Yards rolled out their new masterpiece, the Imperial-class Star Destroyer, the Venators continued to be the mainstay of the fleet of the nascent Galactic Empire for several more years. By the way, a small note, in the so-called New Canon, everything was almost the same except that the ISDs appeared a year later, after the Clone Wars. A very unpleasant aftertaste of the war was caused by the unvanquished Separatists and other dissenters, and there were plenty of them, and they had enough troops. Especially many toothy remnants of the Confederacy were glaring with ill intent at the core worlds, and the inner rim from the worlds of another ring, the outer rim. Conquering these territories took a long time and a lot of bloodshed. Or not conquering, but recapturing, depending on whom you sympathize with more. The Imperial armed forces offered everyone entrenched in the outer rim to lay down their arms and either become law-abiding citizens or exit their comfort zone straight to the afterlife. The Separatists howled about, "We will never forget, we will never forgive, and will terribly avenge." But they could not look at the Empire and its squadrons without fear, on whose ships the Republic emblems had not yet been painted over. Some tried to negotiate, preserving their independence, and those who did not wish to live in harmony might not live at all, with the Imperial fleet's cannons ready to assist them in this regard. Industrialized planets engaged in active trade were the first to surrender. The merchants there did not care to whom they paid tribute. The sight of warships in orbit and soldiers with blasters running through the streets was altogether unnecessary, uninteresting, and unprofitable for them. If you consider the Empire cruel and unjust, let me remind you that all large and powerful states throughout history behaved like bandits. When the latter attempted to appear strong and snapped back at the actions of the large and powerful, they were conquered. Alternatively, they were made a part of the larger, stronger body. And in these conquests, presented as liberations, thousands of Venators proved very useful. Beyond that, the fate of the ships was less joyous. After the crushing of the remnants, a large-scale fleet reform occurred with even greater speed, changing the strategy of waging war once again towards the concept of large artillery ships. Venators, being a hybrid of a heavy cruiser and a carrier, did not fit well into the new reality, yet they remained among the best ships of this class in the galaxy. Moreover, the local conflicts and rebellions that flared up here and there did not require the use of numerous carrier groups. However, the ability to transport many troops and have powerful onboard artillery for fire support from space was just what was needed. Many minor uprisings were often suppressed without a single shot from the ship squadron. Before the arrival of Venators or Imperators in orbit, all those fiercely independent could scream as much as they wanted that they would give their soul and body for their freedom, chant slogans, and engage in other foolish activities. But when they looked at the Imperial cannons, they understood that such defiance could swiftly send them to the next world. Then the desire to chant slogans and rebel somehow quickly vanished. And what happened next? First cries for freedom, then the realization of the grim future, and then the local population could themselves hand over to their imperial guests the scoundrels who had conceived and executed all this. Gradually, Venators were being replaced by Imperators and Victories. The Imperial Command regarded these as more promising ships despite their enormous cost. For a Venator in the Republic's treasury, 59 million credits were required. An Imperator, however, cost the Republic's and later the Empire's taxpayers already 150 million credits, although the price could vary significantly depending on the ship's modification. Some modifications cost 100 million, and there were star destroyers so packed with expensive equipment that their price soared to 180 million. The available Venators were carefully analyzed by special commissions for further use. After the bloody war and the subsequent defeat of the remaining separatists, as well as the destruction of pirates and other enemies of the regime, many ships had sustained damage of varying severity. Repairing some of them was deemed impractical, albeit possible. These ships were dismantled for scrap metal on numerous junk planets, including in the new canon of Jedi Fallen Order. Naturally, weaponry, reactors, electronics, and other valuable items were removed in advance for subsequent use in building new ships or for sale on the secondary market. The Empire was very willing to trade used equipment and technology. Additionally, some ships were sold or transferred to pro-imperial armed forces, particularly the corporate sector fleet. While the merchants of this sector were more interested in victories, they received 350 of these star destroyers. Moreover, decommissioned ships were sent to reserve fleets in the core worlds and the Outer Rim, where they were preserved just in case. This just in case arrived in the form of the Yuuzhan Vong, who came without knocking, without asking, and without conscience. However, the scarred faces had to deal not with the colossal Imperial fleet, but with the significantly weakened New Republic and even weaker Imperial remnants. During the Galactic Civil War, Venators in Imperial service could be found in sector fleets of the Outer Rim worlds, meaning they were deployed on secondary fronts. Provincial Moffs also did not stay on the sidelines and sometimes used Venators as their flagships and personal transport. Imperial Venators differed from the ships of the Grand Army only in their color, uniform gray, whereas the Grand Army ships were brightly painted and sometimes bore the emblems of their fleets and squadrons. In the Imperial fleet, these designs were considered unnecessary. A similar situation is described in the new canon. For example, near a space station in orbit of the planet Anthan Prime in the Outer Rim, one could notice Venators accompanied by a couple of light cruisers of the Arquitans class. Almost a Clone Wars picture. But this was several months after the Battle of Yavin. The final role assigned by the Imperials to the old Venators was that of a mobile training center for training fighter pilots. For this role, the flying airbase was perfectly suitable. Also, I've come across 2 mentions of Venators being used by commercial companies as ordinary transport container ships. Indeed, it is very humiliating for such a magnificent carrier cruiser to serve merely as a cargo vessel. Although it must be admitted that in this role, the Venator could also showcase its best qualities thanks to a large hold, a convenient central hangar, and the presence of several additional hangars that facilitated the loading and unloading of cargo shuttles and allowed for the simultaneous servicing of several transport vessels of different classes. Naturally, Venators were sold to private individuals without weapons, as one could never predict what harmful conspiracies commerce might plan again. Both the old and new cannons, the most combat-ready Imperial squadrons, especially those located in strategically vital regions of the galaxy, were rearmed to Imperial Star Destroyers by the year 14 before the Battle of Yavin, which was 5 years after the Clone Wars. Nevertheless, even in this relatively peaceful time, Venators occasionally had to engage in combat. The outskirts of the Empire were filled with pirates, smugglers, and plenty of heavily armed savages. For instance, when the Galactic Empire faced the conqueror Nusto SVA from the unknown regions, he was met not only by an elite death squadron with Vader and Thrawn, but also by simpler squadrons with older ships, including Venators. But as always happens with large-scale rearmament and decommissioning of equipment, some Venators ended up in the wrong hands. And they got there quite legally. A few ships, formerly considered flying scrap metal, managed to be acquired by the Mandalorians through indirect means. No less than a dozen Venators ended up with the Zan Consortium, the criminal empire created by Tiber Zan. A pirate group with a Venator in its fleet is also known. However, pirate luck eventually turned its back on the bandits. On the other hand, the Rebel Alliance apparently did not manage to acquire a single Venator. At least I found no mention of such an acquisition, which is somewhat strange considering how actively the rebels utilized the legacy of the Grand Army of the Republic and the Confederation fleet. When the Galactic Empire began to rapidly collapse after the Battle of Endor, Venators, albeit not immediately, began to be used by some Imperial remnants. For example, the so-called Restored Empire, led by Enix Devian. In my opinion, the Venators were most effectively utilized by Madam Admiral Natasi Daala. Her group was called the More Irregular Fleet. She had few ships and all of them were old, but Daala was considered a good tactician for good reason. During the Second Galactic Civil War, which lasted from the 40th to 41st year after the Battle of Yavin, the intervention of this fleet changed the course of the second battle over Fondor. Later, Daala again defeated her opponent by successfully engaging her ships in the second battle at Duro. Soon, the war ended. Natasi Daala was elected president of the Galactic Alliance, and she carefully hid her fleet, which included at least 2 Venators, for a rainy day. A wise decision, as the fleet came in handy after Daala was overthrown by the Jedi in a coup d'etat. In the history of this fleet, there was another major battle. In the 44th year, the irregular fleet of Maw once again engaged in combat during internal Imperial conflicts. This took place near Exo 2, a planet in the Meridian sector of the Outer Rim in Grid R7, but this time luck turned away from the old lady Daala. Both sides suffered very heavy losses. Please note that at that time, Daala's Venators and the Venators in the fleets of various small states had already been in service for over 60 years, as new Venators were not built after the Clone Wars. For Star Wars, this is already a considerable age. But this was not the end of the Venators' story. Then, as is known, a large void occurs in the chronology of Star Wars. Between the mid-40s and up to the 127th year, until the Sith Imperial War. A void that was planned to be filled before the universe's purchase by Disney. And now, alas, the mouse is filling the voids, but we can see with what. In the original Star Wars, in the expanded universe, after the 127th year after Yavin, events raced ahead like a gallop. A very interesting gallop, described on the pages of a magnificent comic book series and a couple of reference books. This era is called Legacy, the Legacy era. It would seem that from the moment the Venators were commissioned, a century and a half had already passed. New warships appeared, including new Star Destroyers, such as the Pelion-class ships named after you-know-who. It would seem that the Venators should have already gone into the dustbin of history, but not so. In some smaller fleets of local states, Venators continued to serve. A certain number of them were even used by the remnants of the Galactic Alliance under the command of Admiral Gar Stasi. In particular, they used several Venators during the evacuation from Mon Calamari in the 137th year, although primarily the new project's ships fought against Darth Krayt's forces. While the Venators had not lost their value, they were nonetheless quite worn. A century and a half is a venerable age. Let's summarize. I'm very fond of the Venator, but when considering the ship, it had to be assessed objectively, and therefore I could not help but add a bit of tar to this honey barrel. Despite all the existing shortcomings, the Venator-class Star Destroyer was an outstanding ship of its era, becoming more than a worthy response to the military doctrine of the Confederacy of Independent Systems. And immediately after the Clone Wars, it served the Galactic Empire very well. The Venators were famed as versatile ships that could become indispensable in any part of the galaxy. And it is precisely Venators that can be considered the progenitors of the long series of ships bearing the proud name Star Destroyer.